Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
Support comes from Mercedes-Benz of Buckhead, where the power of electric meets the power of Mercedes. Introducing a lineup of electric vehicles, the EQB, the EQS sedan and SUV, the EQE sedan and SUV. The vehicles are all electric. The feeling is all Mercedes. Mercedesofbuckhead.com.
You're confused. You think I'm on trial. These people are on trial for trying to steal an election in 2020. I'm not on trial, no matter how hard you try to put me on trial.
District Attorney Fani Willis tells a judge that the motions to disqualify her from the Georgia election case are contrary to democracy.
In a dramatic hearing, lawyers sparred and accused each other of being untruthful, both sides trying to convince a judge to buy their version of events, with the prosecution of former President Donald Trump at stake.
So let's be clear, because you lied in this. Let me tell you which one you lied in. Right here. I think you lied right here. No. This is the truth, Judge. And it is a lie. It is a lie.
I'll bring you the latest from inside the Fulton County Courthouse.
And I'll bring you the latest from under the Gold Dome, and later we'll talk to WABE's business reporter, Marlon Hyde.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
And I'm politics reporter Rahul Bali. It's week 6 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Dome Scramble, a pop-up podcast about the legislature and more from Political Breakfast and WABE News in Atlanta.
So, Sam, we actually haven't talked all day today. I want you to just set the scene at the Fulton County Courthouse.
Rahul, I have spent a lot of time at this point in Judge McAfee's courtroom, and today felt different. The pews were packed to the gills with lawyers and reporters and even some members of the public who were curious and wanted to watch. And after weeks of lawyers trading motions, it was something to see the key players talking about these sometimes uncomfortable personal details right there up on the witness stand. And Rahul, it is now 7:30 p.m. on a Thursday night as we tape this. I've still got another round of filing to do, and I kind of just keep singing this radio song to myself. You know, that one that goes, "I'm still alive, but I'm barely breathing." That's how I feel right now.
You know, me being a little older, I probably have a couple of different songs in my head. Hey, so kind of remind us how we got to this point, how we got to this hearing.
Multiple defendants, including Trump, are accusing Willis of financially benefiting from their prosecution. They point to her romantic relationship with Nathan Wade, a prosecutor she hired for the probe. And they argue that the longer this case goes on, the more money he makes to fund their vacation travel together. Fulton Superior Judge Scott McAfee will have to weigh all of the evidence unearthed during these hearings and then consider what case law says about disqualification. But after hours of testimony, it is not clear to me what he might do.
So let me take you to the state capitol for a second. I was in the state Senate, and there were actually lawmakers who had iPads out watching the testimony, and you could hear them kind of, you would see their reactions. What stood out to you about all the testimony?
This hearing really seesawed from the tedious to the combative. Right as lawyers were arguing over whether Willis could be forced to take the stand, she appeared in the courtroom and declared that she wanted to testify, calling the push to disqualify her contrary to democracy. Multiple times, defense counsel implied Willis and Wade were being untruthful, and Willis outright accused the other side of lying. A lot of this hearing focused on a key question: when did Willis and Wade's relationship start? A former friend of Willis testified she had no doubt it began in 2019, before the Trump probe began, and that conflicts with Wade and Willis's account of events. They maintained they didn't start dating until 2022. Wade even told the judge during his testimony that he had cancer during the pandemic and barely left his house during that time. Both said the romantic relationship ended last summer.
Wow, Sam, so they're not dating anymore. But what about this whole question about financial benefit?
Yeah, this is really cuts to the heart of the question here. A lot of scrutiny has been given to Willis and Wade's travel expenses. The two prosecutors say that they roughly split all the bills, with Willis reimbursing Wade in cash.
If you've ever spent any time with Miss Willis, you understand that she's a very independent, proud woman.
I'd object.
So she's going to insist that she carries her own weight.
Defense attorneys, though, seemed really skeptical without any records of bank deposits to back it up. This is Wade going back and forth with Craig Gillen, a lawyer for defendant David Schaefer.
You don't have a single solitary deposit slip to corroborate or support any of your allegations that you were paid by Mrs. Willis in cash, do you?
No, sir.
Not a single solitary one.
Not a one.
And this question of expenses is really important because it gets to whether there was a financial stake for Willis and Wade in the outcome of the case.
So, Sam, what's next?
Well, if Willis is disqualified, the whole Fulton DA's office would be taken off the case too. Then a state prosecutor's counsel has to appoint a special prosecutor. But for context, as you know, no prosecutor has been appointed for the Burt Jones probe 18 months later. Remember, that's Georgia's current lieutenant governor. DA Willis was disqualified from prosecuting him for alleged activities during the 2020 election, back when he was a state senator. So the outcome of this hearing and Judge McAfee's decision could affect whether the Georgia election case goes to trial this year at all. Professor Clark Cunningham, a legal ethics professor at Georgia State University Law School, told me what Judge McAfee does may change American history.
You know, Sam, I saw you tweet that quote out, and it just kind of added to the gravity of what this hearing was, along with all the reaction on Twitter. My phone just kept blowing up. So, man, thanks for what you did there today, covering that.
The stakes are really high. Rahul, as you know, as we've been talking about, I was away from the Capitol for a bit of this week. But before we get to our guest on the podcast, can you just give me a lightning round of some key legislation that maybe I missed?
So here's Rahul's lightning round. Swatting legislation. This is people who make the hoax 911 calls that lead to large police responses. That did pass out of committee. There was an addition of houses of worship to the legislation, so that's going to be interesting. On the issue of tort reform, whether you can sue an insurance company directly if you're in an accident with a large truck. Georgia's one of the few states that allows that. We had legislation on that pass out of the Senate. Over in the House, they passed paid parental leave for state employees. Right now, it's 3 weeks. This would take it to 6 weeks with the birth of a child, the adoption of a child, or the placement of a foster child. And we had some developments on gambling. We'll update that in the next segment.
And Rahul, there were elections this week. I thought we didn't have to do that till March 12th. I feel like people might have missed this. Fill us in.
So we have 3 vacancies in the Georgia legislature right now. One of them because State Senator Mike Dugan resigned to run for Congress. Another one because State Representative Barry Fleming resigned so he could become a Superior Court judge. Now, in the race to replace Senator Dugan, there's a winner. That's Tim Bearden. He's a former state representative, and he'll be taking office here in the next few days. Over in the other race, which is in the Augusta area, that's going to a runoff between a former county commissioner, Gary Richardson, and a conservative commentator, a social influencer named C.J. Pearson that some in our audience may know.
And Rahul, before we go, one other thing I want to mention that happened this week. There's this new dynamic emerging on the state election board.
That's right, Sam. So what's happened is there are 2 new members out of the 5, including a brand new chair and a brand new appointee from the state Senate. And so it's always interesting to see what dynamics may change when you put new people on a board. And both of us were watching that meeting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you saw.
Yeah, we were texting back and forth saying, oh, this is really interesting and kind of illuminating. So let's talk through a little bit about what we learned. So first, I should just note that the state election board enforces Georgia election law, and Republicans right now appoint 4 of the 5 seats on this board. The nonpartisan chair, appointed by Governor Brian Kemp, votes only when the board deadlocks. That happened on Tuesday on a resolution asking the legislature to end no excuse absentee voting. And this was kind of an interesting test case to see how these new members would vote. The new chair, Waffle House executive John Verveer, broke the tie.
For me, it comes down to the will of the people, and the will of the people has been voted on by the General Assembly. The General Assembly is elected to allow no excuse absentee ballots. I will follow the guidance of the General Assembly and will oppose this motion.
The members appointed by the lieutenant governor and the Georgia GOP voted in favor of ending no excuse absentee voting. The members picked by the House Speaker and the Georgia Democrats voted against the measure, and it failed.
You know, Sam, I think this meeting is such a representation of the Republican Party in Georgia when it comes to elections and voting. Two very distinct points of view on how we vote and how those votes are counted. And I think we're going to hear more of this here in the 2024 election cycle.
I think you're right, Rahul. Let's take a break here. This is Dome Scramble from WABE.
Hey, y'all, I'm Mark Kendall.
And I'm David Perdue.
And we're the hosts of What's Good Atlanta, the new weekly comedy podcast from WABE.
On What's Good Atlanta, we run down uplifting and unusual headlines from the universe known as Atlanta.
And while we may not be journalists, we are comedians, and we'll be breaking down news and breaking down the stories that make you smile.
We're just trying to see what's good, Atlanta.
Episodes drop Fridays at WABE.org or wherever you get your podcasts. I get mine from a guy named Craig.
Shout out to Craig.
Mm-hmm.
WABE. Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at wabe.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. WABE.
Welcome back to Dome Scramble. This week, we're lucky to be joined by WABE business reporter Marlon Hyde. Marlon, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
All right, Marlon, before you came to Atlanta, you worked at Vermont Public. What's something that you miss about Vermont and something you've been loving about working in Atlanta?
Well, I miss the cold and the snow. No, I'm joking. Actually, I miss living right by the water. I lived in Burlington, so I had Lake Champlain right by me. Sometimes I would just walk down the street from my house down to the lake, and it was always beautiful. What I love about being here in Atlanta is that it's so vibrant. There's always something going on. I can always catch a show or a basketball game or even a football game. And everybody that comes out is just so sweet. Like, that Southern hospitality is true here.
So, Marlon, let's talk about a different kind of Southern hospitality, Georgia's film tax credit. It's come under a lot of scrutiny. Let's talk about that, Marlon.
Well, I've learned that Georgia lawmakers want companies to spend more to access the state's film tax credit. Sponsors of House Bill 1180 want production companies to do more than just show the Georgia peach at the end of a movie, film, commercial, TV show to get the full tax credit. As it stands right now, to get the base 20% tax credit, a production has to spend $500,000, and under the proposed change, it would double to $1 million with some new criteria, 9 to be exact.
So let's talk more about that. Can you go into more specifics of what those criteria are?
Yeah. So the maximum tax credit you can receive in Georgia is 30%. So it's a base 20% plus an additional 10%. Usually companies like Marvel, when you're watching the Black Panther film, you would notice at the very end of the credits, there's a Georgia Peach logo. That added an extra 10% to the tax savings that they would have had otherwise. Georgia lawmakers want companies to do more than that. So they've added 9 new criteria, which include half of the staff being Georgia residents, half of the vendors being from Georgia, half of the production days shot in rural communities, and even includes participating in a workforce program. And the 9th criteria is doing some type of marketing for the state, which still includes showing the Georgia Peach logo at the end of a film, or at the end of a production, I should say.
So, Marlon, you've been following legislation to make it harder to organize a labor union in Georgia. And this is a really big deal as Georgia increasingly becomes a hotbed for new electric vehicle and battery manufacturers that are mostly non-union. Unlike Michigan, where I'm from, Georgia is not very heavily unionized. So what exactly does this bill do?
Well, let's take a couple steps back. You're from Michigan, so you know a lot about the automotive industry, I assume. Georgia has been leveraging state incentives to attract EV manufacturers here. This bill would tie the state's economic incentives to how workers seek union representation. If workers want to join a union, then they have two options, which is a secret ballot and voluntary recognition. Under this bill, if employees at a company want to join a union, they must use a secret ballot method, or else the company would not qualify for the state's incentives.
Okay, so basically to sum up here, what you're saying is that if a company just goes ahead and decides to voluntarily recognize a union without a vote, then they would not be able to get any of these really lucrative tax incentives.
You're right on the point, Sam. And I spoke with Democratic Senator Nabila Islam Parks about why she voted against the bill. She says it violates federal law.
We know that there will be a lawsuit from unions, Georgia unions, and the Republican Party will lose in trying to strip away workers' rights. And this is going to cost Georgians, taxpayers, hundreds of thousands of dollars when we should be prioritizing healthcare, education, and infrastructure.
I also spoke to some Republicans in the Senate, like Senator Bo Hatchett. He doesn't believe the bill breaks any laws, and he voted in favor of the bill.
This just says after January 1, 2025, if you're going to get an economic incentive from the state of Georgia, you have to allow individuals to cast a secret ballot. It is not a requirement.
Republicans argue that secret ballots actually protect workers' identities when it comes to union votes compared to voluntary recognition. Hannah Perkins is with the Georgia AFL-CIO. She argues that it jeopardizes the safety of workers.
A lot, and I mean a lot, of intimidation happens during a secret ballot election.
When I spoke with some representatives from Georgia unions, they say that voluntary recognition is often cheaper and quicker than using a secret ballot, which could lead to months before a contract is actually negotiated.
So, Sam, while we're talking about the economy, I want to talk about housing. We talked a lot about it during the last session, but nothing really got done. This week, a Senate committee moved ahead with the Safe at Home Act. Sam, tell me about it.
Well, Rahul, the Safe at Home Act requires landlords guarantee housing that's fit for human habitation. The bill also mandates a 3-day cushion to pay rent after receiving a late notice and caps security deposits at 2 months' rent.
Now, I did catch up with Republican State Representative Casey Carpenter, who is the author of the bill, and this is what he had to say about it.
We thought as representatives that it was time that we stood up and said, look, enough's enough. We just felt like there wasn't enough teeth in the law to protect individuals.
As I mentioned, housing legislation did not get done last year, and Representative Carpenter believes it will get done this year because it wasn't the merits of the bill that was the issue. It just got caught up in House versus Senate politics.
Now, Rahul, Georgia is one of only a few states at this point without any basic tenant protections. But one thing that some housing advocates do worry about this particular bill is that it doesn't include a definition of what it means to be fit for human habitation. And that could really leave things open to interpretation of individual landlords.
Hey, Marlon, one other thing I want to talk about. You know, one of my favorite things at the state capitol is pulling lawmakers to the side and saying, hey, what are you getting phone calls about? Like, what are constituents and people calling about? And once you move out all the politics today, one of the most common answers I've heard, property taxes. Tell me what you're hearing about legislation on property taxes.
As there has been a jump in property values across Metro Atlanta, some lawmakers, including Republican Chuck Hofstetler, chairman of the Finance Committee, are in favor of a bill to cap increases of home values assessed for property taxes to 3% per year, while Republican House Speaker John Burns proposed doubling the state's homestead tax exemption, which could likely cut tax bills by nearly $100 million across the state. Voters would have to approve the plan in a November referendum.
Marlon, speaking of housing, you were looking into a report out this week from the Atlanta Regional Commission that Metro Atlanta will add almost 2 million more people by 2050, which is kind of mind-boggling. What does that mean for our region in terms of housing, as we mentioned, but also like transportation infrastructure, recreation, any other number of resources that a growing community needs?
No, you hit it right on the nose. All the aspects that you've named will be affected. Metro Atlanta's population is expected to grow to around 8 million people over the next quarter century, which, again, is mind-boggling. The Atlanta Regional Commission just approved $168 billion in federal, state, and local funding to improve transportation as the population continues to grow. A lot of this population growth is going to be focused in Fulton, Gwinnett, Cobb, DeKalb, and Clayton counties, and a lot of it will be primarily populations of color.
And as we know from covering politics, those changing demographics matter a lot, not just for the economy and the infrastructure of Metro Atlanta, but also for the shifting politics and what candidates get elected to office.
I think that that's also a very important thing to add, because we're also getting older. The report also predicts that the 75 and older population will double to just under 1 million people. And, one of the hot button topics that whether it's inside of the house or outside the house, affordable housing. It's always going to be an issue, especially when you have so many people here and you're expecting more people to arrive. So when we're talking about population growth, it's only exposing the issues that already exist, and it's giving some headwind that things might get worse unless we take some steps to be proactive. For example, replacing older buses, replacing MARTA rail cars, fixing some of our roads and bridges and other aging infrastructure. And what some people within the ARC are saying is that this will all be done while trying to keep a focus on building cleaner environments for the future.
Marlon, let's switch topics to another issue that I get questions about in person and online: legalizing online sports betting. How much money is in online sports betting? A lot of attention came its way after the Super Bowl just passed. Share some of the numbers with us.
According to Statista, the sports betting industry in the U.S. generated a revenue around $7.5 billion in 2022. Some of the best performing states is New Jersey, which brought in a revenue of over $3 billion in revenue and around $500 million in taxes. For Tennessee, our neighbor, they brought in around $1 billion in revenue and around $200 million in taxes. And Tennessee is a state where there are people who live in Georgia that go over to Tennessee. Probably last weekend they went over there to participate in some form of betting.
So I'm at a recent Hawks game with my kids and my wife, and I look up, and it's Marlon Hyde. And Marlon, you were talking to fans at a Hawks game about sports betting.
Yeah. When you say that, it sounds like I was on the court, but I was really in the stands talking with some of the fans, and they said that there's still ways for Georgians to get in on the action.
My name is Scott Lipinski. I'm from Roswell, Georgia.
So Scott, Georgia has been making moves in the path of legalizing sports betting, but it's not quite there yet. Are you in favor of sports betting?
Yes, I am.
Do you have any experiences with sports betting, either here amongst friends or out of the state?
A little bit amongst friends. There still is a few things that are legal right now, like prize picks, where you just choose individual players and whether they score or have a certain amount of rebounds and all that. I do that a little bit.
If sports betting became legal, like full sports betting became legal, would you partake in that?
I think I would a little bit.
Do you think Georgia could benefit from something like that, i.e. tax revenue or other opportunities?
I'm about to have 2 kids go to college, so if it helps the Hope Scholarship, I'm all for it.
Overall, when I spoke to fans, whether they were super knowledgeable about sports betting or they never tried it and didn't know a thing about it, they were all in favor of it. Now, granted, I was speaking at a sports event, but overall, sports betting has provided a lot of revenue for states across the country. And as it continues to grow in popularity, there are residents that are thinking, why isn't Georgia getting in on the action? When you look around State Farm Arena, you'd see ads for casinos or even Georgia Lottery. There are people who are looking at the sports betting bill and saying, why don't we have any casinos? I think the bill that's on the floor is opening a lot of questions for Georgia residents right now.
Now, we should note there has been opposition at the Capitol. Some of the main opposition include religious groups who bring up issues that this could cause for families, especially when it comes around gambling addiction. There's actually been some interesting stories, both by ESPN and CBS, about gambling-related issues. So those are some of the main opponents that you see around online sports betting and actually any kind of expansion of gambling. I do want to update our audience on the bills of note. There's Senate Bill 386 that did pass out of the Senate. It is now in the House Higher Education Committee. This is what would allow sports betting in Georgia. It does include a constitutional amendment, so that means it would have to be approved by Georgia voters. And then there's Senate Resolution 579. That's the actual legislation that would lead to the constitutional amendment and the voter referendum. Some of the notable changes: 80% of the money would go to pre-K and then Hope scholarships, 15% would go to a responsible gaming fund, and 5% for promoting sports within the state of Georgia.
Marlon, before we let you go, I think a lot of people think about business reporting as covering corporations or the stock market, very, stuffy Wall Street Journal type. But I wonder how you think about what is a business story and what's a business story for WABE.
Well, again, thank you for that question. I see it as telling the story of Atlanta's business community. While, yes, I do cover Atlanta companies like Coca-Cola and UPS, I've also done coverage on entrepreneurs with disabilities, Black restaurant owners, and Latin and Hispanic entrepreneurs. I have the honor and privilege of covering one of the most diverse and vibrant cities in the country. So I try my best to tell a story that's representative of the A.
WABE's Marlon Hyde, thanks for spending time with us. Thanks for sharing your reporting.
It's always a pleasure talking and hanging with you guys. Thank you for having me. And also, I'm a big fan of the show.
Thanks, Marlon. And that's it for this week. Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers, and our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
You can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast. And check out WABE.org/Under the Gold Dome. We'll be back next week.